Hello and most welcome to 1231 of the Heidegger series. We'll continue here with an interesting critique of Lee Smolin. But supposing we grant the possibility that we are to suppose counts as an unprecedented situation, how is this universe supposed to distinguish between unprecedented situations and familiar ones? Can it really tell that quantum physicists in 2013 are asking the same question when they repeat an experiment performed 50 years ago? Can it really tell? Aren't unprecedented things happening all the time? If only we avail ourselves of this kind of combinatory power. As I type these words, I am sat in a cafe in Berlin, staring out of the window. Watching the precise fluctuation of every leaf in the trees that line the street. The couple next to me are paying for their meal and murmuring their thanks to the waitress. There are 3 young girls outside, petting a tiny dog on a bright red leash. Is this combination of circumstances novel enough to create a new law of physics? And if not, why not? Isn't a newfangled quantum laboratory setup precisely this kind of recombination of existing phenomena in a novel way? A second and much more important problem with the idea that the universe may determine humans to tickle some novel response out of itself is that there is still no room for free will whatsoever. Our lives remain entirely dedicated by universal regularities, right up to the point when something unpredictable and hence equally beyond our control just happens. If Smolin would like to suggest, a la Gerald Lanier, that the human beings are more than biological computers, then his argument requires some account of how our species in particular is capable of harnessing the plasticity of nature and making it our own. In the absence of that account, the mere fact of evolving laws grants a much free will to rocks or tables or washing machines or indeed computers, as it does in human beings. I think that's a rather good point. Consciousness and the problems of essentialism So perhaps it's the case that Smolin has brought some unscientific presuppositions about free will and consciousness to bear in the formulation of his thesis after all. How else to break the tautology inherent in his assertion that novel situations introduce novelty into the universe? Where does that novelty come from? I think Smolin might be tacitly presupposing that human consciousness is some miraculous source of novelty that is not in itself caused by anything else. This is Smolin's only explicit discussion of consciousness, drawn from closing pages of Time Reborn. The problem of consciousness is an aspect of the question of what the world really is. We don't know what a rock really is, or an atom, or an electron. We can only observe how they interact with other things, and thereby describe their relational properties. Perhaps everything has external and internal aspects. The external properties are those that science can capture and describe through interactions in terms of relationships. The internal aspect is the intrinsic essence. It is the reality that is not expressible in the language of interactions and relations. Consciousness, whatever it is an aspect of the intrinsic essence of brains. End of quote. This argument is harmless insofar as it goes. However, as the above passage freely concedes, the very notion of inner essences is by definition well beyond the reach of scientific validation. And if Smolin does mean to suggest that consciousness has a practical role to play in explaining human inventiveness, or perhaps even the evolution of the laws of physics, then he faces a problem familiar to all adherents of a dualistic theory of mind, namely, how is it that the purely inner essence may simultaneously reach out and influence external events? There are games being played with language here. One cannot define consciousness as distinct from the cut and thrust of external relations. And simultaneously require that it does all the work that Smolin needs it to. Neuroscience, free will, and the sensation of now. Even more problematic than Smolin's discussion of inner essences is the emphasis he places on our species' subjective awareness of the present moment. Setting himself against a long history of thinkers who would write off the sensation of now as a psychological quirk incompatible with timeless physics. Smolin goes so far as to call it the deepest clue we have as to the nature of reality. Once again, I deeply distrust that this desire to twist the universe to fit particular hunches, but if it were true that humans had a particular intimate sensitivity to what Smolin characterizes as an open movement, teeming with unresolved quantum possibilities, then it is readily easy to imagine that our agency may in some way stem from this idea. Unfortunately, and quite apart from physicists' objections to the very idea of a present moment, there is a robust neuroscientific evidence that humans' perception of time over short intervals is not at all that intimate or acute. Take flash and beep tests, for example. I put in a short pause here as well. Take flash and beep tests, for example. These involve the exposure of experimental participants to near simultaneous bursts of light and sound. Controlling for the respective transmission speeds so that either the beep or the flash can be relied upon to reach the participant's senses a few hundred milliseconds in advance of the other. Individuals, nevertheless, find it notoriously difficult to identify which came first in their subjective experience. And this is for the entirely unsurprising reason that it takes the brain a certain amount of time which is longer than an instant to get a handle on any given sense data. And often varying amounts of time depending on the sorts of signals being received. Sounds, for instance, are often processed more rapidly than visuals, and so may appear to arrive first in subjective experience. Even if, objectively speaking, they turned up after a flash. In everyday life, it seems likely that we make use of other cues, such as our own motor actions, to put such disparate signals into registration. But under laboratory conditions designed to eliminate such cues, it is possible to reveal that our sensation of now is actually a blurry concatenation of real-world events that are in fact spread out over short periods of time. Smolin may of course be right for independent reasons that reality consists in a series of discrete movements. But his experiment would seem to rule out the idea that we have any kind of immediate access to them. But even if we did, could we choose to influence them? Once again, the picture coming from neuroscience is not particularly encouraging. There is, in fact, a rather troubling history of pronouncements that free will must be illusory on account of the fact that conscious decisions can be entirely predicted from unconscious brain activity, observed up to several seconds earlier in fMRI scanners. See the work of Benjamin Libet, but also his followers such as John Dylan Haynes, Thankfully, such fatalistic research has been fairly conclusively undermined by the analysis of Dennett and others who point out two key flaws. The first flaw is the setup of the experiments. Researchers have only found it possible to relate decisions to rather small and uninteresting mechanisms in the brain by requiring that the participants make strictly spontaneous choices with no forethought or planning. The second flaw lies in the interpretation of the results. By assuming that you may be predicted by prior brain activity, Libet et al. Betray their doggedly dualistic assumption that one's consciousness is somehow instantaneous. And may therefore be contrasted with the slow, mechanical chugging of the brain. In short, the neuroscience of free will has often proceeded with precisely Smolin's hunch that consciousness exists in the present moment and is capable of issuing directives from that dimensionless space. And it has come up wanting a far more sensible alternative is that you are your brain's processes. And that thinking in time, as Smolin would have, might actually take some time. The naturalistic alternative. Why predictability sets us free. But if consciousness is simply the brain chugging away, according to the laws of physics, then what kind of freedom is that? It is not freedom from the universe, that's for sure. But I don't think we need that. But what we really need is freedom from natural disasters, from hunger, from disease, from those other members of our species who would exploit us, and also freedom from ourselves in those instances where we have become stuck in self-destructive ruts. It is my view that those kinds of freedoms, where they exist, emerge from our species' non-miraculous capacity to perceive patterns in the world and ourselves, and to make wise decisions accordingly, to learn and adapt, in other words. By these lights, Smolin's prospect of radical unpredictability only limits our capabilities. I would at one instant suggested to Smolin that free will not only requires some predictability, it actually correlates with the degree to which predictability is possible. How else can we channel nature or fortify against it if we don't know what's going to happen next? Smolin's response, as best as I recall, was that we never know exactly what's going to happen next. And that life always involves some degree of risk. In the face of uncertainty. This is certainly true to the limit, but I fear that Smolin may have missed my point, which is this: who could possibly benefit from the increased risks of the unstable universe? A bridge is built to withstand a certain strength of gravity. A computer is reliant for its functionality on the precise electrical conductivity of certain components. Sorry, something's happened to my screen here. a cancer treatment will exploit some regularities in body chemistry. We do not want these patterns to dissipate. I embrace absolutely Smolin's advocacy of perpetual innovation and his warnings against the dangers of dogmatism. But one can only ever adapt to circumstances that are either static or at least moving more slowly than you can. Once again, Smolin may well be right for independent reasons. That the laws of physics are open to change, but the science of free will cannot benefit from this fact and must necessarily be the science of a human plasticity that outstrips the plasticity of nature more generally. Tackling climate change and negotiating personal relationships. Before I close, here's a couple of more examples designed to show how the naturalistic approach to free will can tackle those issues close to Smolin's heart more effectively than his own more radical thesis. Smolin opened his Bristol talk with a foreboding prediction drawn from climate science. In 2080, the average temperature on Earth will be 6 degrees warmer than it is now. He then asked whether this was a fact set in stone or whether we could choose to influence it. And claim that we could, as a direct result of the openness of physics. But what of those other predictions stemming from climate science, such as a concerted effort to reduce carbon emissions will avert disaster? If the true nature of physics undermines the certainty of the first prediction, does it not also undermine the certainty of the second? What these awkward questions are intended to reveal is that climate science does not predict the actual future. It lays out possible futures based on different sorts of assumptions. The first prediction, as cited by Smolin, assumes that humans will do nothing. The second, that I just introduced, assumes that we will wise up and take action. Consider the analogous forecasts we make when we see a brick hurtled in our direction. First, it's going to hit me. And then I'll avoid it if I duck. Do we have to change the laws of physics in order to undermine the fatalism inherent to the prediction? That the brick will hit us? Of course not. We simply have to take whatever evasive action seems wise. And recognize that our choice to do so may always have been part of the equation. And in fact, we'd better hope that the future is predictable, because if the laws of physics go changing up on us after we committed to a course of action, then perhaps we'll get hit by the brick after all, or disastrous climate change for that matter. Finally, in the case of personal relationships, Smolin would have it that a faith in an open future may be the key to a healthy union. If you're in a relationship or a marriage and you've been stuck in fixed position and battling from them, for 10 years, and you think that's just her position, and my position, and things will never change when you're thinking outside of time. But if you think this is a process and I don't know where this is going, but I'm in, then you are thinking in time. I wouldn't wish to say that in an otherwise healthy relationship, this kind of easygoing flexibility couldn't be a wonderful thing. But I would like to add that it is also true that many people and many relationships get stuck in fixed positions precisely because of a misplaced hope that the future will be different. Charlie Kaufman's screenplay for Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is a good illustration of this idea. Choosing to free themselves from the trauma of a relationship turned sour, Joel and Clementine undergo a radical surgical procedure to have their memories of each other eradicated. The slate wiped clean, the couple happened to encounter each other afresh. Only to fall in love for precisely the same reasons as before. The bittersweet conclusion of the film hints at the fact that the relationship may be doomed forever. Repeat this cycle of initial ecstasy and subsequent pain. Dennett has a lovely phrase to describe what Joel and Clementine are doing. By attempting to escape their memories and reclaim their ability to live in the present. They are making themselves small. That is to say that they are denying themselves the chance to encompass the patterns and patterns of the past, and hence surrendering themselves to those patterns absolutely. Conclusions towards a better kind of myth. Short pause here. In a recent Guardian article, "Philosophy Isn't Dead Yet," the philosopher Raymond Tallis heaped praise on Time Reborn, identifying Lee Smolin as one of a number of thinkers engaged in a broader campaign to rescue contemporary physics from its floundering mathematical excess by relating it back to our everyday experience of reality. Is it time, Tallis concludes, citing the physicist Neil Turok, to connect our science to our humanity, and in doing so, to raise the sights of both. I'm all for interrogating foundational assumptions in science. That's certainly how progress is made. I'm also fascinated by the question of how human experience fits into the grand scheme of things. But the idea that we should conflate these two quests is a great mistake. And is itself somewhat momentary and free of an appreciation of history. As a cursory glance at the study of mythology reveals, humankind has long attempted to weave our hunches about ourselves into our picture of the world. It is time, Tallis concludes, citing physicist Neil Turok. Oops. Sorry. To connect our science to our humanity, and in doing so to raise the sights of both. I'm all for interrogating foundational assumptions in science. That's certainly how progress is made. I'm also fascinated by the question of how human experience fits into the grand scheme of things. But the idea that we should conflate these two quests is a great mistake. And is itself somewhat momentary, and free of an appreciation of history. As a cursory glance at the study of mythology reveals, humankind has long attempted to weave our hunches about ourselves into our picture of the world. It is only in the recent centuries that we have begun to learn from the shortcomings of this fledgling cosmologies. And to separate out what we'd like to be true from what may actually be demonstrated. To try to return to a form of inquiry based upon what feels right is no novel innovation. It is a relapse into old habits. Of course, I can readily understand the temptations of Smolin's worldview. In the face of those who would seem to dehumanize our species in order to make us consistent with the laws of physics. Richard Dawkins' phrase about being lumbering robots springs to mind.